Good day. This is ENG 308, Study Session 4. Literature Review and Methodology. Introduction. In this study session, you will learn about literature review and methodology in a research work. Without these two important aspects of a research, your study will lack the needed validity and credibility. As such, your research work, be it long essays or term papers, must include sections for literature review and methodology. Learning outcomes. After the study session, you should be able to 1. Discuss the relevance of literature review. 2. Explain methodology in research. 3. Define methodology in a research. 4. Explain the relevance of research methodology. Literature review. What is literature review? Since research implies an attempt to take a critical look at a subject of investigation, it means there must have been some previous works on such a subject. Therefore, for every research, there is a need to look at what has been done on or said about the subject of investigation. The act of looking at what has been said about a phenomenon for research purposes is called literature review. Literature review can be seen as a detailed critical examination of some previous works that are relevant to the current study. It is carried out to know what other researchers have or have not done, why, how, and where. Through the literature review, the researcher will be able to note the gap left by the previous studies. It entails surveying and selecting materials or previous studies on your subject matter, studying them critically to note their relevance to your work or research, comprehending and evaluating the basic findings and arguments of such studies, writing and synthesizing them orderly in the body of your research. Olayinka and Owumi 2006 Ditto 61 asserts that the review of literature performs the following functions in a study: provides a conceptual framework for the research, provides an integrated overview of the field of study, helps to establish a need for the research, may help to clarify the research problem, and helps to demonstrate the researcher's familiarity with the area under consideration. For example, subject matter, theory, and/or methods. ITQ. Why should a researcher keep up to date with researches in the field on which he or she proposes to research? ITA. To avoid duplication of research, which in turn will lead to lack of progress. How to select materials to review. The following factors are cardinal to the selection of materials for review in a research. 1. Accessibility of materials. The library readily provides researchers with numerous and different kinds of materials for research purposes. These materials include textbooks, journals, encyclopedias, dictionaries, collected essays, newspapers, theses and dissertations, all of which serve as good sources for eliciting information and knowledge for research purpose. As a researcher, you must be familiar with the library in order to be able to obtain the needed materials for your study. Today, the internet also serves as a viable means for sourcing materials. The websites of publishing firms give up-to-date information on recent publications. Also, several journals are now being published online. Hence, it is now mandatory for you as a student to search not only the library but also the internet for materials. 2. Relevance of the materials. Literature review is not meant to just list or summarize any study or research. It should contain only those studies that are relevant or related to your research. The relevance of materials to your study should be judged by, first and foremost, the subject matter, then your research problems and questions, the aim and objectives of your research. When you have identified your research problems, questions, aim and objectives, you will be able to pick out materials that relate to the area you are about delving into. 3. The currency of the material. This is another factor you must consider before selecting any material for review in your research. Try as much as possible to limit your review to materials not older than 10 years. Avoid stating obsolete materials. When your study is full of only old materials, what will be deducted is that you are only recycling cake ideas and you have nothing new to offer. However, old materials can be used when it is essential to do so. The following questions will aid you in writing literature review. 1. What are the available materials that are relevant to your study? 2. What are the relevant theories to the research topic? 3. What have other scholars or researchers done in the area of the study? 4. What are the research findings of contemporary researcher in the area of study? 5. What gaps is or are left by the previous researcher? 6. What methodology should you adopt for the study? 7. What are the research questions that can be generated from the findings of the previous studies? How to write literature review. In order to review studies in your research, you will have to start by selecting relevant materials to your study. As noted above, their relevance should be based on your research questions, aim, and objectives. You will have to examine these selected materials, stating the assertions and noting whether you agree with or oppose such opinions. Following Olayinka and Owumi 2006 Ditto 62, in writing a literature review, you will have to do this. 1. Indicate the ways in which the materials you are reviewing will be relevant to your research. Their relevance could be in terms of the information provided, the theory and methodology adopted. Undertake an unbiased citation of papers with contrary reviews. 2. Demonstrate that you understand the similarities between these works, paradigms, and define where they stand in relation to one another, as well as indicate your research stance in relation to them. 3. The works that you refer to should reflect recent scholarship as well as those considered of seminal importance. If possible, cite papers less than 10 years old. 4. If the study is cross-disciplinary or comparative, you need to describe how the different areas of research can be drawn together in a meaningful way. 5. You can cite your own previous work but must show moderation. 6. Cite only papers or studies or materials you have actually read. 7. As much as possible, avoid citing unpublished, non-peer-reviewed materials. Methodology. The term methodology in research basically refers to the strategies of data collection and analysis. It is important for you as a researcher to carry out a thorough library readings before collecting data. As a matter of fact, a field research on which data are usually collected cannot be carried out without a proper library reading. A good field research and data collection begin in the library, with an extensive literature review on the subject at hand to point the researcher to relevant observations for subsequent analysis and evaluation, Iwara, 1999. The methodology of a research shows the reader how you will provide answers to your research questions and achieve your aim and objectives. A major preoccupation in methodology is data collection and analytical procedure to be adopted. Data. By data, we mean the information collected for the purpose of research analysis that will lead to an increase in human knowledge. The analysis of data should give us more insight about the phenomenon from which the data is derived. For research purposes, we identify two types of data: qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative data are information collected in numeric form. The data provide less detail on behavior, attitudes, motivation, context, and are usually gathered using well-structured scientific, statistical, and mathematical instruments. On the other hand, qualitative data deal more with narrative data in a natural setting. They are usually stretches of expressions from subjects. Qualitative data could be extracts from interviews, recorded interactions of language users, text from newspapers, literature, books, and so on. In collecting qualitative data, consideration must be given to the participants' cultural, social, and historical settings. In sum, quantitative data make more use of statistical and mathematical instruments and calculations, while qualitative make less use of such but depend more on subjective materials. From the foregoing, it should be clear to you that language and literature studies deal more with qualitative data analysis. As such, in your researches as a scholar of language, you may make use of more qualitative than quantitative data. However, it is better to adopt both if need be. For instance, in a stylistic analysis of a text, you may have to count the numbers of sentences used based on their types, functional or structural. This means that the use of quantitative data is not irrelevant in language studies. Types of data. The idea of data should not be anything strange to you now. It is commonplace in academic research. The term simply refers to pieces of information gathered by a researcher on the subject of his or her investigation. According to Frankel and Whalen, 2006, the term data refers to the kinds of information researchers obtain on the subject of their research. It is common to identify three main types of data. Thus, A. Cardinal or numerical data or discrete variables, quantitative. These are those which can only take certain values. An example is the number of nodes in the cowpea plants. B. Nominal or categorical data. They are simply facts that can be sorted into classes and be enumerated. C. Ordinal or continuous variables. These are those that have ordered relationship to one another and can take any value in a certain range. Also, we can identify data types as either primary or secondary. A researcher collects the primary data himself or through research assistants by studying the subject of investigation directly in a natural setting. On the other hand, secondary data are those collected by other researchers for some other research endeavors, but which another researcher now finds relevant to his or her study. Hint: primary data is the data you gather yourself for your own research, while secondary data is the data another researcher gathered for his or her own research, but which you reuse. Data collection procedure. Before you can proceed to the level of analysis in your research, you must have gathered the necessary data needed for such. The nature of the data and the method for collecting such vary from one research topic to another. In other words, your research topic, aim, and objectives will determine the procedure of collecting your data. For instance, in a constructive study of English and any Nigerian language, you will have to elicit the Nigerian language forms from the native speakers of such a language before you can compare and contrast them with English. The native speakers from whom you collect language forms are known as informants. If the Nigerian language is your language, you can act as your own informant. If you are carrying out a discourse analysis, you will have to gather data from speech interactions that give rise to a discourse, for example, classroom interaction, doctor-patient interaction, religious sermons, and so on. Data could be collected through observation, participant or non-participant, interview, and group discussion. The instruments that could be used for such collection include questionnaire, word list, voice or video recorder such as a tape recorder, camcorder, and so on, writing instruments, note and pen, and so on. Whatever method you adopt for data collection, you must make effort to describe such methods and variables involved in the collection of the data. Such variables relate to the subjects, for example, the people from whom data are collected. You will have to give information about their age, sex, language, occupations, and so on. In the following section, we will explain the methods and some procedures that can be adopted for data collection. 1. Elicitation. This entails deducing language forms from people, most of the time bilinguals. It's a process of asking informants to give or translate word list, such as the Ibadan 400 word list or Swedish word list. Sentences or text which could be written or oral to the language you are analyzing. The translated words are transcribed either simultaneously while collecting them or after recording them. This will demand the researcher to seek for information of such a language and establish a good rapport with them. However, before collecting such language forms from them, the researcher has to ensure their competence in the language. Elicitation also entails collecting discourses in real-life situations. For instance, it may be a recording of interactions between a doctor and his or her patients, a buyer and a seller, a classroom interaction, media interviews of important personalities, news broadcasts, and so on. It may also involve extracting news stories or adverts from newspapers or magazines, or discourses from literary text such as drama, novel, or poetry. Elicitation will definitely involve the use of instruments such as a recorder, video or audio, or word list. If need be, you may have to carry out an interview or use questionnaire to probe further on the factors that have influenced the language use of the informants or subjects in the communicative situation from which you have collected data. For a socio-linguistic research, a questionnaire or an interview becomes handy for probing into the language use of the subjects. Such questionnaire or interview must be structured to reflect the research goals and must contain variables that influence language use. Such variables include age, location, the language spoken by the subject, sex, cultural or religious background, relationship between interlocutors, subject of discourse, setting, participants, and several other factors. It should be noted that your research topic will determine the method or instrument you will use. 2. Observation. Observation simply means paying attention to something for specific purposes. As a researcher, you have to take proper notes of all the sections of your informant and the factors that influence them. You must watch out for both linguistic and non-linguistic cues that will be given by your informant or subject. You will watch out for social factors, facial expressions, gestures, and physical space between interlocutors, as this will point some things out to you about the language use of your subjects. On observation, Iwara, 1999-37 asserts that in sociolinguistic interview, for instance, the researcher may be looking for the language ordinary people use on the street, arguing with friends at home, or at home blaming their children. Coherence is sometimes an issue in the study of ordinary language. Narratives told to insiders may be more fragmentary and or less well informed than those told to outsiders. No serious study of a speech community can take place without involving both types of interlocutors. The interviewees should also include not only family members and friends, but also strangers. The performance of individual speakers is also to be considered. Observation is categorized into participant and non-participant. The researcher actively takes part in the speech act from which he or she wants to take linguistic data in participant observation, while in non-participant observation, he or she takes no part in such a speech situation. The researcher takes a back seat, observes without interrupting, and takes note and even records the situation. In instances where, as a researcher, you are making use of published texts such as newspapers, magazines, and literary work, you will have to make a choice of such a text based on your research topic and objectives, read through them, and take extracts from them. Sample and sampling techniques. A sample is simply a small part of your data that is subjected to analysis, or a part of the population you studied. Having collected your data, or before you gather your data, you may have to carry out what is technically called sampling. Sampling simply means that you take a thorough look at the data or possible sources of data to see if the data reflect what is needed for your research. It could also mean a part of your data you will use for analysis. For instance, you may take instances of interactions you have recorded in a speech situation that involves a buyer and a seller as samples for a discourse analysis of market interaction. Again, it will not be possible for you to investigate all buyers and sellers, as you need to select a sample that will represent these buyers and sellers. Usually, a researcher may not be able to subject a whole text to analysis, that is, analyze word after word, sentence after sentence, or all recorded interactions. It is not also possible to collect, say for instance, all market interactions if the researcher is working on a market discourse. It is then necessary for him or her to break such text into smaller bits which can be seen as samples. This is done through sampling techniques. The following are the sampling techniques you could adopt as a researcher. 1. Purposive sampling. To use this, a researcher deliberately selects his data based on preset ideas or reasons. It simply means that the researcher selects data based on the purpose he or she has in mind. Such a purpose may be motivated by research interest, other researchers, and the relevance or application of such researchers. 2. Random sampling. Here, The researcher simply and indiscriminately picks his or her data from possible sample units. For instance, in a stylistic analysis of newspaper editorials, a researcher can simply pick any newspaper, say, The Punch, The Nation, The Tribune, and so on. 3. Stratified random sampling. Here, the researcher groups or stratifies the possible sources of data into different classes based on variables such as age, location, sex, first language, and so on, before making a selection. For instance, in a market discourse analysis research, a researcher may choose to select his or her data from a set of interactions where the interlocutors are of the same sex or of opposite sex. It should be noted that before adopting a method for data collection, you should consider your research topic, aims, and objectives. You must also read through literature to see what methods previous researchers have used, the advantages and disadvantages of some methods, and then critically ask, what will be the best method for your research? ITQ. What sampling technique will suit a project like this? Acceptance of nice, proverb-rich songs among titled men in your town. ITA. Purposive sampling. Theoretical framework. A research work without a theory cannot be better than a layman's speech on the subject matter. A theory is a concept on an abstract expression of something. As a researcher, you will have to use relevant theories to gain a better insight into the subject of study and properly explain it. Normally, in a field of study, there are several theories and different theories view the same phenomenon differently. For instance, transformational generative grammar may view the sentence from the innate or competence perspective, while systemic functional grammar views it from the contextual or functional perspective. It is then necessary for you as a researcher to select a theory to which your study will be anchored. What informs such a selection? This question simply takes us back to your research topic, aim, objectives, and level of language analysis, where a research is situated. All these factors determine the kind of theories you use. The level of linguistic analysis will primarily demand that you use a theory in the level. For instance, a syntactic analysis will demand using a theory of syntax. In order to select a theory for your research, ask the following questions. 1. What is my research topic? 2. What are my research aims and objectives? 3. In which level of linguistic analysis is my research situated? 4. What are the theories found in the level of linguistic analysis? 5. Which theory best suits the analysis of the data of my research? Study session summary. In this study session, we have looked at two basic stages of research: literature review and methodology. We noted that before you can select studies to review, you have to look at your research topic, aim, and objectives. The same goes for methodology. It is important for you to note that your research will not be complete without these two important elements: literature review and methodology. We have come to the end of study session 4. Thanks for listening.